He found a broken woman wandering his land. Her only words a desperate whisper. "I'm not clean." He offered her shelter, but she hid from his every touch. The secret she was so ashamed of was not a crime, but a story of survival written in scars. And when the cloth finally fell, what he did next would either save her soul or shatter it forever. Jedediah Stone was a man who spoke the language of solitude. His ranch, a sprawling, dusty kingdom in the heart of Texas, was both his life's work and his self-imposed exile. 10 years ago, a fever had claimed his wife, Maria, and with her, it had taken the part of him that knew how to laugh, to hope, to connect. Now, his days were a rigid, unyielding routine of hard work, his heart as fenced in as his land. He rose with the sun, he ate his meals standing by the stove, and he fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep after dark. He was a good man, respected by his neighbors for his honesty and his skill with cattle, but he was a man they knew from a distance. He was a fortress, and he had long since forgotten where he had put the key. He was riding the southern fence line, a monotonous, sun-baked task. His mind a quiet hum of familiar thoughts, the price of feed, the threat of wolves, a coming storm. It was a world of practicalities, a world he controlled. It was in this predictable silence that he saw her, a lone figure, stumbling through the heat haze, her movements erratic and weak. She was a ghost in the shimmering light, a specter of human suffering where there should have been only dust and sky. His first instinct was suspicion. The wilderness did not offer up its secrets gently, and strangers were rarely a good sign. He rode closer, his hand resting cautiously on his thigh, near the worn leather of his holster. As he approached, the specter resolved into a woman, a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, though it was hard to tell. She was covered in a thick layer of grime and dust, her hair a tangled, matted mess that clung to her face. Her clothes were little more than tattered, filthy rags, offering scant protection from the elements. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were wide with a haunted, vacant terror, the eyes of someone who had seen the very worst of the world and had not yet found their way back. They were the eyes of an animal caught in a trap, waiting for the final blow. She didn't seem to notice him until his horse's shadow fell over her. She flinched violently, a small, terrified cry escaping her lips as she scrambled backwards in the dust, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. Jed dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He held up his empty hands, his voice a low, rough rumble, a voice unaccustomed to speaking with softness. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you. You're on my land. Are you lost?" She didn't answer. She only stared at him, her body trembling uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. He could see she was severely dehydrated, her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin burned red by the Sunday pity, a feeling he had long since buried, stirred within the dusty chambers of his heart. He unstrapped his canteen, uncorked it, and held it out to her. She stared at the water, a primal thirst warring with her profound terror, but she made no move to take it. It was then he noticed how she was clutching the tattered rags around her shoulders, a desperate, white-knuckled grip, as if they were the only thing holding her together. The brutal Texas sun was beginning to set, and with the dusk came a sudden, biting chill. He knew, with a rancher's certainty, that she would not survive another night in the open. With a heavy, reluctant sigh, he unbuttoned his own sturdy, canvas duster coat, a garment that was his second skin, a shield against the world. He folded it and held it out to her. It was a simple, practical gesture, an offering of warmth and cover. Her reaction was anything but simple. As he held the coat out, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She scrambled back again, shaking her head frantically, her haunted eyes filling with fresh tears. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper, a sound like scraping stones, a plea that made no sense. "Number, please. I'm not clean." The words so strange, so full of a shame that went far beyond mere dirt and dust, hung in the air between them. "I'm not clean." Jed stood frozen, the heavy coat in his hand, staring at the broken woman before him. He had offered her kindness. and she had recoiled as if he had offered her a venomous snake. He didn't understand. He didn't know what demons she was fighting. But in that moment, the lonely rancher, the man who had closed his heart to the world, felt a forgotten door creak open. He had stumbled upon a mystery, a profound and heartbreaking puzzle that he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him to his very core. He could not simply ride away from. Jedediah did not press the issue of the coat. He simply left it on the ground near her, along with his canteen, and backed away, giving her space. He told her his name was Jed, that his ranch was just over the rise, and that there was food and a fire waiting if she chose to accept them. Then he mounted his horse and rode slowly away, not looking back, a silent invitation hanging in the twilight air. He did not know if she would follow. But an hour later, as he sat by his fire, the cabin door creaked open. Elara stood on the threshold, a trembling silhouette against the dark, her body wrapped tightly in his large duster coat. She had made her choice. Her first days at the Stone Ranch were a study in silence and fear. She was a ghost in his home, a whisper of a presence that was almost not there at all. Jed, true to his word, gave her an immense amount of space. He set her up in the small guest room, a room that had once belonged to his wife's younger sister and still held a faint, feminine touch. He would leave meals for her on a small table outside her door, knocking softly before retreating, never forcing an interaction. It was through these quiet, distant observations that he began to notice her strange, obsessive behavior. The theme of uncleanliness was not just a passing phrase. It was the central, governing principle of her entire existence. She would only emerge from her room after he had left for the day's work. He would return in the evenings to find the cabin unnaturally clean. The floors were scrubbed, the dishes were washed and re-washed, the surfaces polished to a shine. But it was not the cleaning of a grateful guest. It was the frantic, ritualistic cleansing of someone trying to purify their very surroundings. He noticed she would never touch anything directly if she could help it, using the hem of her sleeve to open a door or pick up a cup, and she was pathologically focused on keeping herself covered. She wore his large duster coat at all times, even inside the warm cabin, cinched tightly around her as if it were a suit of armor. When he left a set of his late wife's clean, simple dresses for her, she accepted them with a silent nod, but he would see her wearing 2 or 3 layers at once, always ensuring her shoulders, her back, and her arms were completely obscured. Her greatest terror, he discovered, was mirrors. There was a small, silver-backed mirror that had belonged to his wife hanging in the main room. One afternoon, he returned early to find Elara frozen in the middle of the room, staring at her own reflection with a look of such profound horror and self-loathing. It was as if she were seeing a monster. She was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at her own skin. Without a word, Jed walked over, took the mirror from the wall, and placed it face down in a chest. The relief that washed over her was so immense, she almost collapsed. He was a practical man, a man of logic. He tried to understand. Was she hiding a disease? A disfigurement from a fire? Was she a religious fanatic, consumed by a strange sense of sin? Every theory he concocted seemed to fall short of explaining the depth of her self-hatred. He felt a growing, frustrating pity for her, but also a burgeoning protective anger at whatever, or whoever, had broken her so completely. For her part, Elara was living in a state of constant, terrified vigilance. This man, Jed, was unlike any she had ever known. He was quiet, patient, and asked nothing of her. His kindness was a language she didn't understand, and it terrified her. She expected the other shoe to drop at any moment, for the kindness to reveal itself as a mask for some cruel demand. So she kept to herself, making herself as small and as invisible as possible, her past a constant, screaming ghost in her mind. She would watch him from her window as he worked the ranch, his movements strong, steady, and capable. She saw him be gentle with a newborn calf and firm with a stubborn stallion. He was a man of quiet strength, a man who seemed to belong to this land. He was everything the men from her past were not. And this realization, this glimmer of a different kind of man, was the most terrifying thing of all. Because it threatened to give her something she had sworn, She would never allow herself to feel again. A tiny, fragile sliver of hope. A month passed, and the strange, silent rhythm of their cohabitation continued. Elara remained a ghost in Jed's house, and he remained a distant, respectful guardian. He had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, to the faint scent of soap, and the sight of immaculately clean surfaces. He had even, to his own surprise, begun to miss her silent presence when he was out on the long, lonely rides across his land. The fortress of his heart was still locked, but he was becoming increasingly aware of the quiet, gentle soul who was now living just outside its walls. He knew something had to change. This strange limbo could not last forever. But he also knew that any direct attempt to breach her defenses, any sudden move, would send her retreating back into the shell of her fear. The opportunity, when it came, was not born from a grand plan, but from a simple, frustrating necessity. He was in his workshop, trying to repair the delicate inner workings of his grandfather's old pocket watch. It was his last remaining memento of the man, a treasured heirloom that had stopped ticking weeks ago. The gears were tiny, intricate, and his own large, callous fingers, so adept at mending fences and roping cattle, were far too clumsy for the delicate task. He had been struggling for an hour, his frustration mounting, a string of low curses filling the dusty air. He needed help. He needed smaller, steadier hands. And he knew there was only one other person within 10 miles who could possibly provide them. Making the decision was difficult. It meant inviting her into his personal space, asking something of her, and breaking their unspoken agreement of distant cohabitation. But the watch was too important. With a heavy sigh, he walked to the main house. He found her in the kitchen, meticulously polishing an already gleaming silver spoon. He explained the situation, his voice awkward, his request hesitant. He asked if she would be willing to help him with a task that required a delicate touch. Elara looked up, her eyes wide, with a familiar flash of fear. Her first instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her room. But then she looked at him, at the genuine frustration, and, surprisingly, the vulnerability in his eyes. He was not ordering her, he was asking. And in his hand, he held the beautiful, broken watch, a symbol of a past he clearly treasured. She saw a reflection of her own brokenness in the small, silent machine. After a long, silent moment, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. In the quiet of the workshop, they worked together. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, not of fear, but of intense, shared concentration. He would explain which tiny gear needed to be moved, and she, with hands that were surprisingly steady and deft, would use a pair of tweezers to gently manipulate the delicate mechanisms. For the first time, they were in close proximity, their shoulders almost touching as they leaned over the workbench. Jed was acutely aware of her presence, of the faint scent of lavender from the soap she used, of the soft sound of her breathing. He watched her hands, so graceful and sure, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sundae. Then, it happened. As he reached for a small screwdriver, his hand accidentally brushed against hers. Elara flinched instantly, a sharp, ragged gasp escaping her lips, her hand pulling back as if burned. The old terror flashed in her eyes, but this time, something was different. She did not run. She did not retreat. She looked from his hand to his face, and she saw in his eyes not anger or impatience, but a look of immediate, profound regret and apology. He held his hands up, backing away slightly, giving her space, his expression saying everything his mouth did not. This was the turning point. She saw that his touch was truly an accident, and that his only concern was for her comfort, not his own frustration. A wave of a new, unfamiliar emotion washed over her. It was trust, a tiny, fragile seed of trust. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and then, slowly, deliberately, she reached out and picked up the tweezers again. She looked at him, and for the first time, held his gaze for more than a second. Which one next? The question was simple, but it was the first real question she had ever asked him. It was the beginning of their first real conversation. And for Jed, hearing her quiet, steady voice, seeing the fear in her eyes recede, replaced by a fragile, determined focus. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The watch on the table between them was still broken, but something else, something far more important, was beginning to be repaired. The shared task of fixing the watch had subtly but irrevocably changed the landscape of their quiet home. The invisible wall between them had been dismantled, piece by piece, in the silence of the workshop. Elara no longer fled from Jed's presence. She would sometimes remain in the main room when he was there, reading a book or mending clothes, a quiet companion in his solitude. Their conversations were still sparse, but they were no longer just about practicalities. He would tell her about a stubborn calf, and she would tell him about a rare bird she had seen by the creek. They were learning the small, quiet rhythms of each other's lives. Jed found himself looking for excuses to be near her, to hear her soft whisper of a voice. The fortress around his heart, which had stood impenetrable for a decade, was now full of breaches, and a gentle, persistent light was beginning to filter in. He saw past her fear and her shame, and saw a woman of incredible resilience and a quiet, deep-seated kindness. And he knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that he was falling in love with the ghost he had taken in from the prairie. The moment of revelation, when it came, was not born from a gentle conversation, but from a sudden, accidental shattering of Elara's fragile peace. Jed had brought in a new set of window panes from town to replace the old, cracked glass in the main room. As he was removing the old pane, he set it leaning against a wall. Elara, entering the room with a basket of laundry, didn't see it. She turned, and for a split second, she caught a full, clear, and unexpected view of her own reflection in the old, warped glass. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. She dropped the basket, a strangled cry of pure horror tearing from her throat. She stumbled back, her hands flying up to cover her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. It was the same self-loathing, the same profound terror he had seen when he took down the small mirror, but amplified tenfold. She sank to the floor, curling into a tight ball, her sobs the raw, ragged sound of a soul in agony. The old Jed would have been awkward, would have retreated, leaving her to her private hell. But this Jed, the man who had been softened by her presence, did not hesitate. He walked over, not to touch her, but to carefully pick up the offending pane of glass and carry it outside, shattering it against a rock. Then he returned and simply sat on the floor a few feet away from her, a quiet, steady, and patient presence in her storm of grief. He did not speak. He just sat, offering her the silent comfort of his strength. After a long, long time, her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. She did not look at him, but she spoke, her voice thick and broken, the words tumbling out as if a dam had finally broken. This was the plot twist, the secret that had festered in the darkness of her soul. She told him the story of the wagon train, of the brutal Comanche raid that had killed her entire family. She told him how she had been captured, held prisoner for a year, treated not as a person, but as property, a slave. And she told him of her escape, a desperate, bloody flight to freedom that had left its own terrible marks. With trembling, hesitant movements, she sat up. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a terror and a plea so profound it stole his breath. She told him she was about to show him why she was unclean, why she was a monster, why she was unworthy of his kindness. Slowly, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage, she turned her back to him. She unbuttoned the top of her simple dress, and, with a final, shuddering breath, she let the rough fabric fall from her shoulders. Jed's own breath caught in his throat. Her back, from her shoulders to her waist, was a horrifying, tragic roadmap of her past. It was covered in a network of thick, raised, and brutally disfiguring scars. Some were the thin, white lines of a knife. Others were the ugly, puckered circles of a brand, the mark of ownership. They were the marks of a survivor. But to her, they were the proof of her shame, the undeniable sign that she was tainted, ruined, and unclean. She waited, her body rigid, for his gasp of horror, for his look of disgust, for him to finally turn and walk away, leaving the monster to her misery. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Elara's ragged, terrified breaths. She waited for the inevitable recoil, the sound of his boots on the floorboards as he walked away from the horror she had revealed. Every second that passed was an eternity of agonizing suspense. She had shown him her monster, and now she was bracing for the rejection that she knew was her due. But the sound she was expecting never came. Jed did not move. He did not gasp. He did not speak. He simply sat there, his gaze fixed on the tragic story written across her skin. He, a man who had seen the brutality of the frontier, who understood that survival often came at a terrible cost, did not see a monster. He saw a warrior. He saw a map of every battle she had fought, every pain she had endured to simply be alive, to be here, in this room, with him. He saw not a story of shame, but a testament to a strength so profound it humbled him. Then, he did something that would change the course of both their lives. This was his all-in moment, an act of pure, unadulterated compassion that would become the foundation of their future. He slowly rose to his knees and moved behind her. She flinched, expecting a blow, a push, anything but what came next. He did not recoil. He did not pity her. He reached out a trembling hand, and with a reverence usually reserved for the most sacred of objects, he very gently, very tenderly, traced the edge of one of the largest, cruelest scars with his fingertips. His touch was not one of passion or of pity. It was a touch of awe. Elara shuddered, a sob catching in her throat. But this time, it was not a sob of pain, but of a shocking, overwhelming release. His touch was not what she expected. It was not a judgment. It was an acceptance. He leaned in, his voice a low, rough whisper, not in her ear, but speaking to the scars themselves, as if to honor them. Jed. His voice is thick with a raw, powerful emotion. This is not the mark of someone who is unclean, Elara. This is the mark of a survivor. This is the story of a battle you won. These aren't scars of shame. They are medals of courage. And with those words, the spell that had held her captive for years finally broke. He was not disgusted. He was in awe of her. He saw not a monster, but a hero. For the first time, she began to see it too. His simple, profound act of acceptance was the confrontation she had needed all along, a final, decisive battle against the ghosts of her own shame. And in that battle, with him by her side, she had finally won. 1 year later, the ghost that had haunted the Stone Ranch was gone, replaced by a radiant, confident woman who laughed easily and whose eyes shone with a deep, peaceful joy. The duster coat was long since put away, replaced by simple, beautiful dresses she wore with a newfound pride. She was no longer hiding. She and Jed were partners in every sense of the word, their love a quiet, steady force that had healed them both. The fortress of his heart was wide open, and the silence in his home had been filled with the music of their shared lives. One evening, as they stood watching the sunset paint the prairie in hues of gold and rose, he gently turned her so her back was to his chest, wrapping his arms around her in a warm, protective embrace. He leaned down and pressed a soft, tender kiss directly onto one of the faded scars on her shoulder. She did not flinch. She simply leaned back into him, a contented smile on her face. The scars were still there. They would always be a part of her story, but they were no longer a source of shame. In the gentle light of his love, they had been transformed. They were no longer marks of a monster, but a beautiful, intricate map that had, against all odds, led her home. If this story of survival and healing touched your soul, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us what part of the story moved you the most in the comments below. Your support helps us heal all kinds of scars.